Next, let's look at the um, putting everything together and looking at the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model using this model to understand the events in the real world. So the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model is a key tool to understand how economics function. It shows how changes in spending and production affect the overall economy, including prices, output, and unemployment. So imagine that the economy is at a stable point where everything is balanced. The supply, the aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand intersect, and we are at this equilibrium point. The price level P is equal to the expected price level, and the output equals its natural rate, the full employment rate, and the level the economy can sustain without overheating or underperforming. And employment is at its natural rate, meaning the economy is neither in a boom or a recession, not a recessionary situation, not an inflationary and expansionary situation. At this equilibrium, the aggregate demand curve and short-run aggregate supply curve and long-run aggregate supply curve intersect at this point of equilibrium, at just one point. Now let's assume that some event happens in this economy, how we are going to understand the effect of that event on the this equilibrium, to understand what happens when the events affect the economy. Let's follow the same four steps that we earlier discussed in the topic of the supply and demand just for one good earlier this semester. So we are going to identify which curve shifts. First, we're going to look at the curve that will be affected. Does the event impact aggregate demand or aggregate supply? Based on the review that we had about the factors that are affecting on the aggregate demand or aggregate supply, we can figure out if the event is affecting on the aggregate demand curve or aggregate supply curve. The second step is to look at the direction of the shift. Will the curve shift left, decrease the demand or supply, or will it shift to the right? Will it increase the demand or supply? Okay. In the third step, we're going to look at what happens to the short run situation. What is the short run effect? We are going to use the aggregate demand and aggregate supply diagram to see how the event changes the output, Y, the price level, P, and the unemployment in the short run. And one more step, we are going to look at the long run adjustment, how the economy will get back to the long run situation, and we will analyze how the economy moves from the short run equilibrium to a new long run equilibrium. Is the new equilibrium the same as the previous one, or we will have a new long run amounts for the Y, P, and the unemployment? Okay, let's look at some of the examples. Assume that stock market crashes. So let's explore a real world event such as the stock market crash. Okay, so when the stock market crashes, people feel less wealthy, so consumption C will fall. This will cause the aggregate demand to shift to the left from 81 to 82. Okay, we are going to see a shift in the aggregate demand to the left. In the short run, the economy moves to a new equilibrium with lower output. From point A to point B, we see fewer output and fewer prices, lower price level, and higher unemployment. Okay, And this creates a gap between the potential production and the actual production. We are going to call it as a recessionary gap, okay? Over the time, as the prices adjust downward, you see this downward price is going to affect on the expectation of the people, and the expectations will affect on the prices, and this will continue this process of the expectations and the real prices, the expectations and the actual prices. It will adjust the prices downward until the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right, bringing the economy back to its long-run equilibrium, with output and unemployment returning to the initial value of their natural levels, but the level of the prices will fall permanently. This is the scenario where we don't have any fiscal policies or any monetary policies at point B, and we are allowing the economy to self-correct. This self-correction of the economy will automatically affect on the prices, will adjust the prices, the wages, and the cost of production. And when the cost of production go down because of the lower price levels, we are going to see the aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply, to shift to the right. Let's look at some of the real-world examples. So, um, there are two important and very big historical aggregate demand shifts. One of them relates to the Great Depression, and the other one is related to the World War Second boom. Let's look at each of them one by one. During the Great Depression in 1929 and 1933, two main reasons, changes in the money supply and crash in the stock prices, resulted in a shift in the aggregate demand. So the economy was at this long run equilibrium. We had this aggregate demand, aggregate short run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply, prices, outcome, and the economy was at the long run equilibrium level. But in 1929 and 1933, because of a problem in the banking system, money supply fell by 28%, affecting on the aggregate demand. And the crash in the stock prices just increased that switch, that shift in the aggregate demand further down, reducing the aggregate demand, the spending of the people at any given price. The prices are the same for now, okay? At this stage, because of these two events, money supply changes and the stock market prices, the aggregate demand shifted to the right because the consumption and the investment were affected. Looking at this new equilibrium point and comparing it with the initial equilibrium point, you see that the output goes down and the prices go down, okay? And that is exactly what we see in the real world. In the short run, in the few years after the Great Depression, we see that the level of the prices, the real GDP has been decreasing. Okay, not the level of the prices, the both the level of the prices and the outcome has been decreasing. So you see this model that we are using, this supply and demand model, is helping us to just predict and understand the real world economy, the real world events as well. Here, the money supply is not, the change in the money supply is not affected by the um, Fed. That's why we don't call it as the monetary policy. Here, this money supply change happened because of a problem in the banking system. So this is not a monetary policy. Okay, and these two reasons are considered as two main factors causing the Great Depression, a huge drop in the um, aggregate demand, and the real GDP fell down by 26%, and the level of the prices went down and caused a huge depression. The next example of a big shift in the aggregate demand is related to the boom during the World War II in 1939 through 1944. In that time, because of the war, government spending surged from 9.1 billion to 91.3 billion dollars. This is a huge difference, huge change in the government expenditures. And when we see this G is increasing, that's one of the elements that could shift the aggregate demand based on all those four levels, those four steps that we were discussing earlier. Let's assume that we were at this long run equilibrium level. The economy was stable, but because of a shift, because of an increase in the government expenditures in this period, aggregate demand shifts to the right, okay? And comparing this new point with the initial equilibrium point, you see that we are experiencing more production and more prices, higher level of the prices. Y increases and the prices are also increasing. This gap between the quantity of the production that is actually happening and the production of the potential and sustainable amount of this economy, this gap between these 2 points is known as inflationary gap. Okay, so when the difference is in this direction, when the actual production is less than the potential and sustainable output or the natural output rate, that is called as a recessionary gap. And when we have the actual output being on the right side or more than the natural output, that is going to be called as the inflationary gap. Okay. Also, during this time period, we see that the unemployment also fell down from 17% to 1% because of this increase in the level of the production. And that is consistent with what happened in the real world during that time period. This model of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply is consistent with this increase in the real GDP in that time period. So these explain examples show how significant shifts in aggregate demand can deeply impact the economy.